This is Litigating History. In this video, we are going to try to make a deep dive into the historical record of a discrete historical fact that is highly disputed to see where the weight of the evidence takes us. In this video, we are going to look at the Battle of Nijmegen on September 17, 1944, and the performance of General James Gavin, commanding officer of the American 82nd Airborne Division. Some claim his decisions on this day resulted in the failure of the entire Operation Market Garden. This is the second in a series of videos. In the first video, we discussed how the decision to de-emphasize the Nijmegen Bridge as a day one objective was made by Gavin's boss, Corps Commander General Frederick Browning, not by Gavin. In this video, we will look at the pre-drop intelligence and whether that decision to de-emphasize the bridge was justified given the available intelligence. A full explanation of the background, plan, and execution of Operation Market Garden can be found in the first video of this series. General Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division's part in this plan was south of Nijmegen. He had a number of important objectives. He had to seize the major bridge over the Maas River at Grave. He had to seize at least one bridge over the Maaswal Canal. He had to seize and defend the high ground of the Groesbeek Heights. He also had to seize the major bridge at Nijmegen. However, Gavin's boss, General Browning, made that objective the lowest priority. His men accomplished all day one objectives except the Nijmegen Bridge. An attempt on the bridge was made by two companies after dark, but the attack was repulsed by the Germans. Another attempt was made the next morning by a third company, but that too was repulsed. The bridge was still in German hands. Historians looking back at the operation with 20/20 hindsight focus on the decision to not make an immediate attempt on the Nijmegen Bridge as a reason for the failure of the operation. It could be argued that the failure to seize the bridge before the link-up with the Guards Armored Division delayed the column as much as 36 hours, dooming the 1st Airborne Division and the entire operation. That is an interesting what-if, but to evaluate whether Gavin, Browning, or Monty, or whoever fell below the standard of care for a competent general with respect to Operation Market Garden, we cannot look at the operation with 20/20 hindsight. We need to evaluate their decisions based upon the information that they had at the time they made those decisions. So the question is, what intelligence did they have at their disposal when they made their operational plans? Remember, Gavin and Browning were not on the continent. They were not at the front. They were back in England, so they were particularly dependent upon the intelligence as reported to them. No modern historical analysis of World War II intelligence can be complete without a clear understanding of the Ultra program, both its power and its limitations. In a nutshell, the British at Benchley Park, with a significant assist by the Poles and the French, had deciphered the German Enigma communications. Secret German military communications were regularly intercepted and deciphered, and daily reports were distributed within 12 to 24 hours. However, the Ultra program was a closely guarded secret. If the Germans knew their communications were compromised, they would change their encryption and the Allies would lose this valuable source of intelligence. So the intercepts were only provided to the Supreme Commander, Army Group Commanders, and Army Commanders. This information could not be distributed to Corps or Divisional Commanders unless verified, or could be disguised as coming from other sources, such as the Dutch underground. Significantly, Montgomery had been receiving Ultra intercepts since North Africa. He was aware of their accuracy and their usefulness. The actual intercept reports themselves are in the British archives, but have not been published that I know of. However, those intercepts relevant to Operation Market Garden were set forth in pertinent part in this Military Art and Science Master's thesis by Major Joel Jefferson. His thesis is generally that the failure of Market Garden was not an intelligence failure, as Ultra had sufficiently alerted Monty to the hazards. However, those hazards were ignored, or perhaps even concealed, as Monty was hell-bent on pursuing his northern thrust strategy. That theory may be a topic for a later day, but what is useful for the purposes of this video is that Jefferson spells out the Ultra intercepts relevant to Market Garden. I'm going to briefly summarize them, but feel free to pause and read. All throughout August, the Ultra intercepts showed that the Germans were in disarray. They had suffered debilitating casualties that were not being replaced. They were exhausted and suffering desertions. It was encouraging reports like these that created the victory fever in the minds of the Allied commanders. It was unimaginable that the Germans could recover. The war was soon to be over. However, starting in early September, the intercepts changed dramatically. For example, the Scheldt estuary was to be defended fiercely, like a coastal fortress. No less than 4 panzer divisions were being withdrawn from the line and moved into the Market Garden area to rest and refit. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was to move to Eindhoven to direct that refit. Generally, the German forces were ordered to stop their retreat and to start the defense of the motherland where they stood now. The 1st Parachute Army was formed to defend the area targeted by the operation, and its forces were to be reinforced with the manpower and weapons necessary to make that defense possible. The ultra-intercepts made clear that not one more step backward would be tolerated. Himmler himself ordered patrols of officers, with presumably permission to shoot, to prevent stragglers from crossing the Rhine without orders. Anti-tank defenses in depth were created, and the defense was to be sustained until annihilation. As the date for Market Garden approached, the ultra-intercepts increasingly indicated that the plan was ill-advised. Field Marshal Model's headquarters had been moved to Oosterbeek, right where the 1st Airborne was scheduled to land. General Student's headquarters was moved to 's-Hertogenbosch, basically a stride into the flank of Hell's Highway. The intercepts even disclosed that the Germans knew the Allies were coming. They may not have known of the airborne component, but they knew the 30th Corps' mission was to drive from Eindhoven to Arnhem. So the higher-ups had access to these ultra reports. They knew or should have known that the complexion of the war had changed. The easy victories of August had come to a stop. However, Browning and Gavin would not have had access to these ultra reports. Nevertheless, you would expect that some of this information would have trickled down to them one way or another. So what were Browning's intelligence officers telling him? Major Brian Urquhart, no relation to the commander of the 1st Airborne Division, was Browning's chief intelligence officer for the 1st Airborne Corps. He was interviewed by Cornelius Ryan's research team in connection with A Bridge Too Far. We can presume that Urquhart had informal access to some of the ultra-intercepts or other intelligence sources indicating that this operation was not a good idea because he was quite frankly horrified by the plan. He couldn't see how they were going to be able to relieve the troops in Arnhem on time. Urquhart, a British officer, felt that the British generals were too obsessed with trying to compete with the dashing General Patton and were being misled by a false impression that the Germans were in complete collapse. To confirm his fears, just a few days before the operation was set to begin, Urquhart arranged for some aerial photographs to be taken of the Arnhem area, and those photographs showed tanks at or near the anticipated drop sites. Browning dismissed Urquhart's fears and Urquhart himself. Before the start of the operation, Browning sent Urquhart away on sick leave. This is one of the better-known controversies of Operation Market Garden. Urquhart was warning Browning, Cassandra-like, of the dangers, but Browning just ignored his own intelligence officer. In Browning's defense, it is not entirely true that Browning totally dismissed Urquhart's concerns. Browning may have just seen the dangers coming from a different direction. For example, from the Reichswald as opposed to around Arnhem. And as far as sending Urquhart off on sick leave, once the decision was made to go forward, having someone around with such a defeatist attitude would only be harmful to morale. It is clear that Browning was being given intelligence that showed the dangers of the operation. But what about Gavin? Well, as a mere divisional commander, he was not in a position to influence whether the operation went forward or not. As they say, his was to do or die. Nevertheless, he had to make his decisions based upon the information that he was provided. This document is the 82nd Airborne Division's Field Order 11, Annex 1C, dated September 11, 1944. This section of this document lays out the information available to Gavin when he first issued his orders for this operation. There is no doubt that the enemy has made a remarkable recovery within the last few days. 25,000 men from the 15th Army have escaped to fight again. The fighting capacity of these new German battle groups seem unimpaired. The 82nd Division was also one of the only divisional intelligence sections to raise the specter of Panzer divisions. The Panzer Division is described as broken and worse for the wear, but is located north of Arnhem and may produce 50 tanks, something that would be normally of major concern to lightly armed airborne divisions. It was definitely established that SS training units had been relocated to barracks inside Nijmegen itself, and there were approximately 4,000 of these troops. The 82nd went into this operation thinking there was going to be a lot of Germans in their area, possibly a whole division's worth. So, the Germans had made a remarkable recovery. They could expect to face up to 50 tanks, and 4,000 SS troopers were in Nijmegen itself. The intelligence annex continues. The flak in the area has been sizably increased. Recent photographic evidence showed 10 light and 33 heavy guns in the immediate Nijmegen area. That would not be surprising, as one would expect formidable flak defenses for a bridge like the one over the Wall River at Nijmegen. Those guns would be a major concern to paratroopers during their drop, obviously. But even after landing, they were a daunting defense. The gun crews themselves represented manpower that would need to be dealt with. A crew of a heavy flak gun would be 6 to 9 men, and the crew of a light flak gun would be 5 to 7. So just the mere manpower of the Luftwaffe gun crews was estimated to be between 248 to 367 men. Of course, those men were armed with lethal 88s or nasty automatic cannon, sighted and exercised in a dual ground role. So the 82nd was told to expect heavy flak, and that heavy flak would be for a dual use against ground troops. So Gavin was provided with intelligence that he could expect 4,000 SS troopers backed up by heavy dual-role flak in Nijmegen itself. But that was not all. In the Siegfried line campaign, MacDonald reports that Gavin was led by reports from the Dutch underground to expect the missing panzer formations to be in the Netherlands and assembling in the Reichswald forest just adjacent to his landing zones. MacDonald supports this assertion with a contemporaneous document, Troop Carrier Field Order No. 4, dated September 13, 1944. According to Meade, this concern was bolstered by a report from Schaeff on September 13 of the gaudy figure of 1,000 tanks hiding in the Reichswald. I have not seen this intelligence report, so I do not know the context of this statement. However, I cannot believe that this statement was to be taken at face value. If that is an accurate statement from the report, I am certain that neither the author nor the reader of that report actually thought there were 1,000 tanks in that forest. Rather, I assume that was a verbatim report from a breathless Dutch agent exaggerating, being the equivalent of a report of a lot of tanks, or more tanks than the agent had time to count. In any event, there were plenty of intelligence threads claiming tanks would be coming out of that forest. Here is another more sober source. This is an excerpt from Forrest C. Pogue's The Supreme Command. Like MacDonald, this is part of the U.S. Army's official history of World War II, and most assertions are supported by footnotes to primary sources. In this excerpt, there is no mention of 1,000 tanks, but it does claim that there are 2 panzer divisions in the Arnhem area, and they are collecting new panzers from a tank depot located in Cleves. This assertion is supported by the Schaeff Weekly Intelligence Summary No. 26, dated September 16, 1944, one day before the operation was scheduled to start. So let us review the battlefield that Gavin was going to be dropping into based upon the intelligence that was available to him. This map shows his area of responsibility. The red arrow shows the basic path of advance for the 30th Corps. Bristling around the immediate area of Nijmegen are 43 anti-aircraft guns, 33 of which were heavy flak guns, along with their crews, sighted for both air and ground defense. In the barracks inside Nijmegen are at least 4,000 SS troopers. So taking the Nijmegen Bridge was no trivial matter. It was going to take the full attention of an entire regiment, at least, maybe even tanks. But the 82nd had other objectives too. The bridge at Grave was equally important, more so in fact, as that bridge was necessary for the Guards Division to be able to relieve them. They also had to secure one of the 4 bridges over the Maaswal Canal, again to be relieved by the Guards, but also to avoid the 82nd from being split in 2 by the canal. Finally, the 82nd had to secure the Groesbeek Heights and the landing zones for resupply and reinforcements. Now this is the Reichswald forest, looming ominously next to the 82nd's landing zones. And here is Cleves, where 2 panzer divisions were supposedly collecting new tanks right on the other side of that forest. And here is the Groesbeek Heights. This is one of the highest areas in all of the Netherlands. It forms a natural defense barrier between Nijmegen and the Reichswald, or the tanks in the Cleves, which could approach Nijmegen Nijmegen on the road via Weiler or to the south via Mook. This high ground also looks down on the 82nd's landing zones and dominates the road and bridges from Grave to Humen to Nijmegen. Given all of this information, it is not surprising that both Gavin and Browning agreed that securing the Groesbeek Heights should be the 82nd's top priority, because if the panzers in the Reichswald could establish themselves on the heights, they could interdict the 30th Corps all along the one road that it needed to pass to relieve the 1st Airborne. With the German tanks on those heights, all would have been lost, and the operation certainly would have failed. So, were there tanks in the Reichswald? No, of course not. We all know that as a matter of historical fact, there were not 2 panzer divisions in Cleves collecting new tanks on the other side of the Reichswald. Those divisions were north of Arnhem at the time of the drop. Rather, the Reichswald was filled with second-rate labor battalions who were hastily organized and thrown into the battle. However, were Gavin and Browning wrong to be concerned about panzer divisions in the forest? Again, the answer is no. The intelligence reports pointed to the conclusion that there were panzer units in that forest or on the other side in Cleves. You cannot judge their decision based on 2020 hindsight, but only on their state of knowledge at the time. On September 16, 1944, while back in Britain, Browning and Gavin had no way of knowing there were no panzers in that forest. They had to make their decisions based upon the intelligence reports provided to them. Those reports led them to believe that Nijmegen was going to be a very tough nut to crack, possibly requiring the assistance of the tanks of the Guards Division, whereas the forest was a dire threat and holding the heights was essential for the operation to succeed. You can argue what-ifs about different dispositions, but you cannot argue that Gavin or Browning were derelict in prioritizing the heights over the bridge. That was a reasonable military decision given the information available. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. If you have a source that refutes my conclusions, I am more than willing to be proven wrong. See you later.